Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Let me introduce you to our guest. Joining us today is Rawia Tawfik. Rawia is a visiting associate professor at the Council on African Studies at the MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale University. She's also a professor at Cairo University. Also with us, Charles Ukeje. Charles is a professor of international relations at the Obafemi Awolowo University in Nigeria. Earlier today at the Wilson Center, they participated in an Africa Program event that was co-sponsored by the Social Science Research Council. The title of that event was Trendlines and Transformations in African Democratic Governance, Lessons for 21st Century U.S.-Africa Relations. We're going to sort of continue that discussion, but I want to let you know if you'd like to watch that longer discussion that also involved a representative from the United States Department of State, you could come to the Wilson Center website, click on the Programs tab, you'll find the Africa Program, or you can find the Events tab and look at past events, and that entire broadcast is available to you. Charles, Rawia, thanks for doing double duty today, appearing in the event and appearing on Wilson Center Now. Great to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So if I could ask you to begin, if it's possible, to generalize. I know we're talking about an entire continent. You know, we have the bad habit of talking about Africa as if it's one place, but of course it's not. But is there a general statement you could make about trend lines as it relates to democratic governance? For example, this Freedom House report that shows a 10-year decline. Of course, that's always uneven. There are bright spots and there are dark spots. But what's a general sense of what you could provide our viewers with of how things are trending? Rawia, let's begin with you, please.
As you mentioned, it's very hard to make generalizations. So I think if I'll make a statement, it will be that we're witnessing a divided continent. That's even how I teach it to my students. So when we look at the map, we're going to find specific trends based on regions. Let's say that. So we have a declining trend in West Africa, for instance, for the coups, the wave of coups in the last few years. We certainly have decline in North Africa, the region where I come from, including in Sudan, where we had, a positive trend 10, 12 years ago after the North Africa uprisings. But again, it did not last, for a long time, unfortunately. And we had counter-revolutionary regimes taking the path towards authoritarianism. So it's a divided continent, and we can look at it in terms of taking a regional focus, basically. I think in Southern Africa, that's where things are doing better. We have, a sustained democracy, an institutionalization of the rule of peaceful alternation of power. And that has been, the trend over the last, 20 years, 20, 25 years. So it depends on the region, basically.
Thank you. Charles, your thoughts on a general overview.
Thank you very much for having me, John. I think that it's important to bear in mind, and you rightly said, that Africa is not a monolithic space. Africa is 55 countries, and these 55 countries have a huge diversity in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of democratic governance. So on one extreme, perhaps you have a country like Sudan, but also new countries that are falling under military rule, like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. But on the other extreme, the good, you have countries like Mauritius, you have Senegal, you have even Botswana, that are doing well. And in recent times, you could see what has happened in Botswana. You could see what has happened, in Mauritius. You could see what has happened in Cape Verde. So it's really a continent of mixed bag. And it's important not to generalize about the African experience or these different experiences. And it's certainly important not to respond to the continent using, just one brushstroke.
Makes total sense. But I am going to generalize one more time.
Okay.
That's in terms of global momentum, right? We've seen populist movements all over the globe. Just an election here in the United States where the top two issues were the economy and immigration. And you can see that in parts of Europe, all over the place. Is Africa separate from that momentum, or is it part of that momentum, this wave of populism that we've seen certainly in the post-pandemic world?
Would that be to Rawia or me?
I'd like to hear actually both of your perspectives. So why don't we begin with you, Charles, since we started with Awia last time?
Okay. I think that we're seeing a very dangerous trend all over the globe, especially in the so-called established democracies in Europe and North America. This morning, I was talking about the fact that we've seen the ascendancy of right-wing political parties and ideology. We've seen growing xenophobic in Europe. We've seen riots and protests that, that's derived from anti-Semitism, and for me, this imposes a challenge because these are also the same countries that have been at the forefront of democracy and democracy promotion. And with the kind of challenges that they face today, I wonder what lessons they want, African countries, that are going through maybe slightly different experiences, what lessons should they take? And certainly, I'm not certain how these countries in Europe and North America, with the empire of challenges that they are facing at home, how much they would have time and resources, to be able to support democracy promotion in Africa. So this is a big challenge.
Rawia.
For me, I think you're right. We have seen in some cases, especially with the latest wave of coups, a return of the populist anti-establishment discourse. So, if you hear the coup leader in Guinea will be kind of reproducing the narrative of Ahmed Sékou Touré, the first wave of charismatic African leaders after independence. The same in Burkina Faso, again referring to Thomas Sankara in the 1980s and his rhetoric. But I think the basic point here is that if you're actually adopting anti-establishment rhetoric and claiming that you're giving power back to the people and you're making this move in order to improve people's life, basically in terms of stability or well-being or what have you, are you able to deliver? And I think the last few years are indicating that these new leaders are not able to deliver, and that is really the yardstick whether they can really rise up to their promises or not.
Based on that, is there a gap between support or desire for democracy and then satisfaction with the results of the democratic leaders currently in power?
I think there is, and for many reasons. I think one has to do with the economic, delivery of democratic system, which has to do with some structural issues, right? So, for instance, 10, 15 years ago, we had this rhetoric of Africa's rise, that Africa, the best place to make investment, to gain higher returns on investment, and so on and so forth. The youth dividend and the need to kind of give opportunity to this rising youth and so on and so forth. But again, we're with all the kind of external shocks that we have been having in the last few years with the Russia-Ukraine war and other regional international crises, is actually kind of revealing that there are some structural issues in African economies that cannot be simply dealt with by leaders alone or by simple policies or policy shifts alone. And on the other hand, we have a trend of democratically elected leaders actually implementing undemocratic and authoritarian practices. So in Tunisia, for instance, President Kais Saied was elected in 2019 using the momentum of young people support and presenting himself as a departure from the past regime that was actually overthrown in 2010. But he has been running a one-man show, dissolving parliament, introducing constitutional amendment in order to increase his powers. So we have this trend also of what I call democracy without Democrats. Representatives being selected or elected in a free way, but then pursuing undemocratic practices.
Charles, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, for me, I think that the material base of democracy is facing significant challenge in many African countries. I think that for growing number of citizens on the continent, from Cairo to Cape Town, the best form that democracy can appear is in form of food. People are finding that they are not able to make basic existential living. And so this in itself poses a very big problem. And there's a sense in which those who have captured the state are also now increasingly weaponizing poverty. So what that means basically is that the people have to contend with a whole lot of issues, including stomach infrastructure. So if today you ask questions, yes, a lot of Africans believe that, subscribe to the whole idea of democracy, okay? But there's now a gap between those ideals and what they are actually confronting, what faces them on a daily basis. In some countries, like my own country, Nigeria, there's a huge problem around the crisis of price hikes. The price of things have grown so bad. In many countries, the middle class has disappeared. And you know that the middle class in most countries are at the forefront of development, of change, the kind of change that we think about when we talk about democracy and governance. So with the dissipation of the middle class in many of our countries, democracy is on free fall, sadly.
So when we look at headlines, that reveals what just happened or what's happening now. But lurking in the background, almost like white noise, are these trend lines, right? Whether it's demographic changes or maybe impact of climate change and what it's doing to certain industries or certain locales. I want to ask both of you, what are the things you can identify in terms of trend lines, things that may not be in the headlines right now, but are really important for us to understand where things are headed? Rawia, let's begin with you.
I think news often focus on bad stories. So we have also kind of good news coming from different parts of the continent. I think Charles referred to Senegal and the election of the youngest democratically elected leader. And the thing is that in many parts of the continent there is a need to change. There is an aspiration for change, whatever this change is heading. I mean, trying something different, trying in new thinking, new policies is what is aspired for. We have seen that in South Africa also after years of the ANC sustaining a majority. It lost its majority and was forced into a coalition government. So there are also cases where there is a capitalization on the a relatively open public space in order to try to put pressure on the government to reverse policies. We have seen that in the protest in Kenya, for instance, against the new taxes that were actually led to reversing this policy. So we're seeing some kind of good news from every corner of the continent, actually.
I mean, you got it right, that good news don't sell, or it's bad news that sells. But there's definitely a handful of good news happening, in different parts of the continent. And I had mentioned earlier, Botswana, after over 6 decades, the ruling party completely collapsed. Okay, in Mauritius, it's the same thing. In fact, in the case of Mauritius, the ruling party has virtually lost, all the subnational government, seats, So we've seen these things happening. I think what we miss is probably to multiply them, to scale them, and to make them sustainable. I mean, for me, this is probably the challenge. Another thing I see is how, civil society, in spite of all the challenges they face, continue to struggle, continue to contend, with the state in different African countries, in very, very difficult circumstances, in very difficult situations. And I think this is why I feel that it's important that all hands are on deck, not just from within, but also from outside, that we need to ensure that the civil space, does not constrict any further. Because if we lose the civic space, if the civic space continues to decline, then we probably would have lost much more than when we have authoritarian governments, holding sway in countries. They are probably the last bastion in many countries. The civil society is probably the last bastion, for democratic consolidation, democratic advancement, and if we lose the civil society, then we probably would have, it would be much more costlier. Thank you.
Charles, about those things that have worked, and the notion of are they scalable, right? Or can they apply in other circumstances? What are the main barriers to taking things that are working in one country and applying them to other situations? Does it come down to funding? Is it political will? Are there cultural barriers? What are the issues involved in that?
I think it's important to bear in mind that different countries have different situations, different contexts. What you can, for instance, apply in predominantly Muslim or Islamic Northern Africa will probably not work in predominantly Christian, countries, in West Africa or in Southern Africa. So I think that what is important is to ensure that different country experiences, are brought to bear in terms of trying to understand what is possible. I believe, for instance, that if you take, for instance, youth, okay, across Africa, more than 2/3 of the population in many instances are young people, and they are doing amazing things. And we need to support those. We need to support them in the spaces that they work in. They're working around issues of empowerment. They are setting up startups. They are working around governance, peace, and security issues. We need to support these things. And for me, I think that young people in Nigeria, learn a lot of lessons from young people in Kenya, and this can be reproduced, across, especially in the age of technology, where young people have access to social media, and through a process of diffusion, they are able to work together and to learn from the experiences of their peer in other countries.
Rawia, what Charles was just talking about, young people and the emergence of youth leaders, are you seeing that in the areas that you work in? Are we seeing a next generation stepping up to the plate?
Definitely, but they're very much frustrated by the established and even the new political elites. In the case of Sudan, for instance, we know that the youth groups basically played an instrumental role in overthrowing al-Bashir regime. But then you have a very militarized context in Sudan, where the need was not just a transformation or a transfer from authoritarian to democracy, but also from war to peace in many parts of the country, and from an economy that benefited a few to economic transformation to benefit the many. And this did not happen and collapsed into the war that we have been witnessing for almost 2 years now. So it depends very much on the context, whether it's actually kind of empowering to youth, whether the new political movements can actually engage these youth and institutionalize the role, or whether they feel actually left out and facing new challenges, including the current war that is going on in Sudan.
Charles, you mentioned the civic space, and then also in your last answer, you started to talk about social media or technology. We've seen examples around the world where new technologies, the way we communicate and the way it's evolving, has been part of a solution. We've also seen where it's the problem, frankly, right? Whether it's misinformation or disinformation. What does the information ecosphere look like in the 55 plus nations that we're talking about? And do we see trends there that show either a breakdown of traditional media or a rise of new media, and media, of course, having an intimate relationship with democratic governance, right? It's hard to have one without the other.
Yes. First and foremost, we've seen in the media space the dominance of young people, especially in the new media. Traditional media are becoming, facing a lot of challenges. I can't remember the last time I bought a newspaper, for instance. I don't have need for newspaper. I can get all the information I need, on social media.
But are you reading newspapers online?
I read them online, yeah.
No.
I read them online. So what I'm saying, therefore, is that we've seen a shift from traditional media to much more digitalized, media space that become also very democratic. Okay. And most predominantly, young people are in that space. A lot of young people are in that space. And what it means is that it has become that virtual space, has become that space where they can express themselves. And you could see how, if you want to understand any country in Africa today, you just need to see what young people, that are dominant in terms of demographics are staying in those spaces because for them, that's their cool space. Okay, that's a cool space for them. That is the space where they express themselves. Unfortunately, we are also beginning to see that space facing its own challenges. Its government recognizes increasingly that these spaces, need to be checked. Government is investing a lot in terms of technology that allows them to turn on social media, for instance. Many governments are investing in new legislations, that will control and tame the social media. And so basically, young people and government are finding themselves in contention in that space. What will be the long-term implications of this for young people and their ability to express themselves? The jury is out. But I do think that for as long as governments see the new media space as a space that undermines regime security, regime integrity, they will find themselves on a collision course with those who use the space. And these are mostly young people.
Rawia, I want to do you want to say anything about the media discussion before I move on to another topic?
I agree with Charles basically that this has been, an alternative media for some time, but again, autocratic regimes are modernizing their toolbox and they're kind of, again, trying to reach out to some people using these same tools and they're increasing their censorship over independent pages, Facebook pages and other, platforms that have been used in the past to promote transparency and accountability and so on. Yeah.
So thank you. I want to ask now about the role of foreign actors, right? And I guess like media, we're talking about a double-edged sword where they can help with the situation or they can be exploitive in their interactions with other countries and they can make things worse. I know today you had the opportunity, both of you, to talk directly to someone from the U.S. Department of State and give some advice to the U.S. on how it should approach its relations with various nations. Talk to us about what we're seeing across the African continent in terms of the changing dynamics of foreign investment or foreign involvement. And is this good news for democratic governance or bad news for democratic governance? And I know as soon as I ask the question, of course, it's always a mixed bag, right? It's never one thing or the other. But anyway, let's get your thoughts on that.
Do you want to start or should I?
Yes. Unfortunately, it has been, basically bad news. Again, in a country like Sudan, where it's a very crowded kind of landscape of different regional, international actors, we have seen that, military support and, economic support has been channeled to military actors. While the very brief period of civilian rule or civilian military partnership, to put it that way, was not actually supported or was not supported enough, unfortunately, by Western democratic government, and was not supported at all, of course, by regional actors who consider democracy to be an existential threat to them and a threat to the regime's survival. So it's mostly, bad news, and unfortunately, even Western democracies are kind of giving priority sometimes to stability over democracy, sometimes to their interest with these regional bad actors that may be more strategic and more important to their interest in other parts of the world than in Africa, which is unfortunately not gaining much traction from these Western circles.
Thanks.
I would add that it's clear that over the years and in recent times, Africa has become a space where all kinds of foreign actors come to experiment. You could see, for instance, the fact that apart from US-Africa relations, you have UK-Africa relations, you have China-Africa relations, you have Turkey-Africa relations, India, Russia, and so on and so forth. And we're seeing essentially a situation in which you have what, for want of a better word, I can call unilateral multilateralism. One in which a country, maybe a country in the West or a country in the East, sees Africa, brings the whole of Africa together for some form of engagement. And for me, I'm not sure I don't think that this kind of engagement, even though it looks like multilateralism and everybody wants multilateralism, but in real fact, it is essentially a projection of power. is essentially a projection of power by these countries. And you find countries like Turkey in the mix. I don't think it is helpful for the continent because basically what happens is that all of the 55 African countries, or 54 as you like, depending on how you're counting, basically go to those meetings and they tell them what they think they should be doing. It becomes a space for projection of power, and interest, more often than not to the detriment of, the different African countries. So at the end of the day, you go to these meetings and nothing comes out of it other than the photo ops, and for me, this is why I believe that Africa's destiny lies in its own hands, and the continent should cultivate partners that can, support it rather than look down on it.
I want to ask each of you a final question in that, a discussion like this, there's not a beginning or an ending, right? Because we're talking
Absolutely.
about a continuum, right? Things change and it's never a straight line. So just give our viewers and listeners some tips on what you'll be watching in the coming months. Are there any upcoming negotiations or elections or other situations that you'll be following that you think could be significant as we try to figure out these trend lines over the long haul? Rawia, let's start with you. What will you be watching in the coming months?
I think, of course, for personal interest, but also for the fact that Sudan is the worst humanitarian crisis now on the continent, I think we need to be watching Sudan since it unfortunately has not attracted, much attention. So the unfolding of the crisis in Sudan, whether the new administration in the U.S. will be able to give some attention to this humanitarian crisis, will be something to watch. But also the fact that, as I said, the wave of coups in the last few years actually were supposed to, bring to power military leaders for a short period, and there should be elections sometime down the road, and we have seen in the cases of Mali, in the case of Burkina Faso, indefinite delays. So whether actually, as I said at the beginning, these new regimes that are not delivering and at the same time delaying elections, whether masses will actually be happy with these political developments in the same way that they welcomed, at least some of them welcomed these coups at the beginning, or will there be a wave of mass uprisings in these countries against these incumbent regimes that are not democratic and are not even able to deliver stability or development?
Thanks, Charles.
I think for me, first and foremost, I'll be watching what is going to happen with the second coming of Trump, President Donald Trump, because I think that what happens to the United States, what happens in the United States is going to have, a whole lot of impact for Africa. I'm not sure that we should give benefit of the doubt that the first Trump administration will be different, even though there is no hope for optimism in this regard. So let's see what happens. For me, this is very important. Secondly, we're beginning to see, trends on the continent that should worry. The coups, everyone had thought that we had gone over and above with coups, but, we've seen 3 countries and maybe 2 that did not succeed. We need to worry about the growing franchise of terrorism on the continent. For instance, today, the most ruthless terrorist group is the Boko Haram, but in the northeast of Nigeria and around Lake Chad and Cameroon. But we also seen a new terrorist group emerging in northwest Nigeria, that is fast gaining ground. So there's a whole lot of concern that if this continues for Nigeria, it will have systemic impact, not just for Nigeria, but also for the whole of the area, Nigeria's neighbors. So for me, these are 2 things that we really have to watch.
Thank you very much, Rawia Tawfik, Charles Ukeje. Thanks for sharing your knowledge and insights with us today in 2 events, right? Earlier with the Africa program and today on this edition of Wilson Center Now. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having us. Cheers.
We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for your time and interest.